Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. I think it's important to pause for a minute and remember who we are at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. We started Camp Good Grief in 1999. This was the first grief camp in the Mid-South. We grew to include other programming and finally the first comprehensive grief center in the Mid-South. So for 26 years, we have been providing grief camps, grief groups, and individual grief counseling for children, teens, and adults from our 3 different locations. We are doing this podcast because clients have been asking for it as a platform for support. That is really the foundation of most of our services, the community asking for more. We are so grateful to our community donors who have generously supported us over the years, as all of our services are free of charge. Again, this podcast was started because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. I sit here as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. I've lost my dad, my brother, my nephew, and several other beloved family members along the way. But I also have specific training in grief counseling, and that's what we want this podcast to be, a place where we can honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the real life perspective as well. So welcome, Christy and Lauren. I'm so glad that you are both here today.
Yeah, we're glad to be here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So we know in our work that we are often just asked so much about what do I need to do? What are the steps? What things do I need to follow so that I can cope and that I can be better, right? That's what we hear so much. And we know that coping is so, so important. But oftentimes when we just throw out coping to people, they're like, well, great, I know I need to cope, but how in the world do you do that? What are the steps of coping? We're not necessarily going to talk about steps of coping here, but we're going to talk about ways of coping, ways that we have seen grieving people of all ages cope with their grief. And that takes many different combinations and it can change, right? Even just how I cope today can change in a week or a month or in a year. And it doesn't mean, oh, I don't use that coping skill anymore. It just means that we have kind of a toolbox at our disposal and that we have to change up what we know that works. And we know that in this work, healing does happen. We see that. But we know, like I just said, there's no steps, there's no secret steps, there's no recipe, there's no vault that is waiting until you are grieving and then you get told, okay, here's what you need to do. And unfortunately, when we're grieving, that's what we want. But we know that that is not what exists.
Yeah. And so, even though we know that there's not a fix for grief, we know that there's not a checklist of things that you can say, okay, you need to do this, this, and this, and then you're done with your grief. We do know that there are things that help with healing, that help with coping, as you said. And what we have found in our work with clients is that when we think of all the different ways of coping that there are, and there are many, we find that they really fall into 6 categories. And so I know that's one thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about today is these categories of coping skills.
Yes. And so let's just jump in. Let's just start. Lauren, pick one that you want to start with.
Well, one of the ones that I think of immediately when I think of coping is support, because we know that we are not meant to grieve alone and that a grieving person needs supportive people around them. And a lot of times when we bring up this issue, the first thing that comes to people's mind is somebody who they can talk with about how they're feeling, somebody who will listen, somebody who understands on some level. And that is so important. And we want for people who are grieving to find others who can give them that kind of emotional support. There are other kinds of support for grieving people, and I think it's important to acknowledge that as well, because any given person may have a number of people in their circles who really care about them, and not everybody maybe is able to provide that emotional support for a variety of reasons. It's hard to see somebody you love hurting, but they still may want to be able to be there for you. And so what we see is that, there are people who maybe can help with, just practical tasks, things around the house, running errands. There are people who they're the ones that can, help you have fun, maybe make you laugh. There are those who just give you kind of that self-confidence boost. They just help you to feel validated as a person. And we know that's so important for grieving people. And so what we really like to encourage people to do who are grieving is to look at the people in your circles and to see what maybe each of them, what are the different ways that each of those people could offer support. And a lot of times then it's important to ask them or to let them know what the ways are that they can help you. And that's challenging. Sometimes it's hard to even know what you need. Sometimes it's just if you notice that someone does something helpful, reinforcing that and letting them know, thank you so much for just sitting with me. That was so helpful, because they may think, oh gosh, I feel like I'm helpless. And so it's important for the grieving person to reach out for support. It's important for those in their circles to ask for ways that they can support people, and just know that there are lots of different ways that you can support a grieving person.
It's so important. And it's so tied up with a person's grief too, right? Because a lot of times when we talk to clients about this, they'll say, well, the person who was my support is who died. And so that can also be something that makes it hard when kind of relearning how to ask people for help or for support, or even just figuring out, that this role is now vacant because the person who filled this role for me is no longer here. And that is so hard and complicates the grief and complicates the asking for the support as well. I think something that sometimes what people will do, kind of those different categories that you were talking about, like when I look out at the people around me, who is the person who is listening well to me these days? Who is the person that is helping me with this? It might be nice to kind of write that down on a piece of paper. So if you're listening to this podcast, like writing that down, kind of these different areas, and then looking at the people in your life and seeing who maybe could fill that spot. But then you're so right, asking, and what we find too, I know Lauren and Christy, y'all see this, is that usually people have a lot of people who want to do something. Just like maybe the grieving person, we don't always know what in the world to even ask for. They don't know also. And so of how can I help you? I just want to, I'm right here. And so they're oftentimes thrilled, from what we know from clients, when you finally say, hey, here's a way I think that you can really help me. And so that's something, if you're listening to this podcast, to really be mindful too, that most of those people out in your circles are really kind of waiting for some direction, and they want to do something.
Absolutely. And what we also hear is that people find new supportive people in their life. And, for example, looking for opportunities to connect with other grieving people, maybe through a support group, because sometimes there may be somebody who you maybe didn't have a close relationship with before, but they come into your life and they're able to meet this need for support for you.
Yeah, think about how many people we've seen in our support groups who've come together and who have never met, but then they do maintain some connection sometimes after group because they're a new person who is filling a new need. That's a great point.
And a lot of times what I hear is at the end of the group, they say, I'm just so happy to know that I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. So that support, just it reinforces that those new needs that we don't even know we have. And some people, the role that they may fill in your support may just kind of be not necessarily always ongoing or, not every day or every week. I had a dear friend who was telling me it was the 10-year anniversary when her brother died, and a friend that she never sees, never talks to, but also has had a sibling death, reached out to her on the anniversary and remembered 10 years later. So sometimes those support people, they come in different types of doses as well. Some things we do need maybe daily, especially in the beginning of grief, but some of those are those long ongoing needs we have with ongoing memorialization. And who are those supportive people who remember the dates, who remember the special things, and who say them out loud to us as we continue. So support, I think too, is one, and I'm glad you started there, Lauren, because we know that in working with grieving people, and especially if you're listening to this podcast because you want to support grieving people, the biggest predictor kind of for how someone is going to grieve is the availability of their support system. So it's important to us as grievers to know that we're going to have to reach out to our support system. We're going to have to maybe give them some direction. But also, if you're supporting someone who's grieving, please understand that is such an important role to show up in different ways of support. What's another area that we think we should explore here?
So self-care is so important in the grief journey because it's really about taking care of your physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. I even say that sometimes self-care doesn't always feel like what you want, but more of what you need.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really about recognizing that your own needs are a priority, paying attention to the signals from your body and making the choice to nurture yourself. And there are many ways that you can do that. Resting is definitely important. Resting when needed. There's this underlining belief that we have to always stay productive, but it's so important to know that it's important to rest. It's important to pause and take care of yourself in that way. Drinking water, being mindful about your nutrition and the food that you eat. People are surprised when I say this, but saying no when needed is a form of self-care.
Absolutely.
When you're able to say no to commitments and obligations that you're unable to fulfill, you're allowing yourself the necessary space and time needed to grieve and heal. Taking hot baths, meditation, getting a massage. One thing that I love is walking in nature. Mm-hmm. These are all good forms of self-care.
And we know people who'll hear self-care and they say, I know. Or they think it's the frou-frou selfish stuff that people do. That is not what we are talking about today. We are talking about necessary things, especially when we are grieving, to care for our physical, emotional, social, spiritual selves.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I agree. I think so often people view, taking care of themselves as something that's selfish. And what's important to keep in mind is that when you are grieving, you have special needs, just as if you were sick or hurt and physically hurt, you would need a little bit of extra care. And it's the same when you're grieving. And what we'll hear too, a lot of times is, because often when people are grieving, their family members or their friends and other loved ones are also grieving. And a lot of times there's this mentality of, I have to make sure everyone else is okay first. I have to take care of them first, especially if it's somebody who relies on you for care, like a child or somebody who's dependent. And what's so important to keep in mind is that in order to provide care for them, you do have to take care of yourself first. You have to make sure that you are in as healthy a place as you can be physically, mentally, emotionally, in order to be able to care for people you love.
I agree, Lauren. Another way of saying that is we can't pour from an empty cup. We have to be able to pour into ourselves. So,
absolutely. And let's just be honest here. That grief is not, first of all, it's not easy emotionally, but it's not an easy time. Not only do you lose this person that you can see, touch, and feel, but now all of a sudden you have all this business you have to do. There's getting death certificates, and you have to have that to do all the other things, and you have to go to Social Security, and you have to drive around, and you have to make appointments. And then you have all this stuff. What am I supposed to do with stuff? Some of it's stuff that needs immediate attention. Some of it's stuff that, we don't even want to touch or look at or think at. And then we have to plan a funeral, plan a service. There's all these things you have to do when all your body is telling you is that it needs rest. It needs to lay down. But a lot of times the business right after the death of a loved one prevents that. And I heard a quote recently, and I don't know who said it, but talking about rest in particular, and I just thought it was fascinating. And it said, there's nothing more powerful than a rested person. And I just thought, gosh, there's so much truth in that, but that's not, our culture doesn't value that. And I can even remember when my father died, I had never felt so tired for months. I was just the fatigue. And that kept going through my head, this fatigue. I had never felt fatigue like that. And so I think also with self-care comes with that thought of just being a little kinder to yourself, with your thoughts, and allowing yourself to care for yourself so that you can care for others, so that you can do these tasks. Grief already makes you feel so just different and absurdly wrong about everything. And so that rest component can really kind of like, charging your phone a little bit. And sometimes our phones stop charging 100%, but even if we can charge it to 20 or 30%, that gets us a little bit down the road. So rest doesn't always have to be a 3-hour nap. Maybe it's, 15 minutes, closing your eyes, kind of charging yourself up just a little bit so that you can go a little bit longer.
I absolutely agree. I've had people to tell me that they even feel this sense of guilt when they're not being productive or moving. And it's so important to just remember, as you say, being kind to yourself and just giving yourself that grace and patience to know that this is temporary. So I agree.
So self-care can also be the bubble bath though, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I
Sometimes
agree.
we need those things, or the hot shower, sometimes those things really are, but it doesn't always have to be the extravagant. Sometimes it is great to go get that massage. We can't go get a massage every day. So what are the other things that we can do for some self-care? And sometimes it's the kindness just to ourselves for 3 minutes,
One thing that we hear from people sometimes, it's sort of like this question of, but what do I do when those big feelings come up? Like, how do I handle that? How do I make those kind of just go away and not come up? And, while certainly there are times where we want to be able to try to regulate the intensity of those emotions, and there are times where we do need to step away from them. And we'll talk about that, I know, in a little bit. But an important piece of coping with grief is also allowing yourself to express those emotions and allowing yourself to spend time with them. And of course, that's challenging because they're painful. But what we know is that we can't keep our grief locked up inside.
Yes.
Because grief is something that we have to process, we have to work through. And keeping it inside and trying to just sort of stuff it down or push it, I always imagine it like pushing it to the back of the shelf. Then that we don't allow it the movement that it needs in order to move toward healing. So we do have to allow ourselves to spend time with our grief and not just spend time with it, but also express it.
Yes.
Taking that internal experience and showing it outside of ourselves in some way is so powerful. Even if we know that in doing that, there's not any fix that will come back to us. There's not anything, for example, if we talk about our grief, to a friend, there's not anything that they're going to be able to say or do to take away that grief from us or to fix it. But there's something very powerful just in the process of expression. Mm-hmm. And expression can take many forms. So, I mentioned talking about it. That's a big one. And we encourage that with the people we work with. But also people express their grief a number of other ways: writing, art, music. A lot of times physical movement can be a form of expression as well. And, it's not always activity. Sometimes it's just allowing yourself to cry. Mm-hmm. Crying is a natural form of expression. And there is a lot of healing and I would say strength that comes in allowing yourself to experience those emotions and show them outside of yourself. There's a lot of courage that goes along with
Absolutely.
that. Grief is hard work. But, what we do encourage people to do is find your ways of expression that feel right for you. What is helpful for one person may or may not be helpful for somebody else. Some people find journaling to be very helpful. Others may not. And that's okay. We're not looking to, for a cookie cutter approach for coping with grief. It's about finding what works best for you. And we're also not saying that you have to just spend all of your time expressing your grief. That's not the goal either. Right. So a lot of times we'll use the phrase dosing yourself with your grief, that you have times where you do lean into it and spend time with it, and you're very intentional about that. And then you also have times where you intentionally allow yourself to step away from it.
I absolutely agree with you, Lauren. A lot of people tell me how music is so powerful to them. And I absolutely agree with that, because sometimes when you don't have the words to express how you feel, sometimes finding that specific song can help move an emotion through you. And one thing that I love about music is, let's just say you're not done sitting with that emotion, you can rewind it back and continue to feel that and lean into that. So there's so much healing and power in music.
Absolutely. And I like that you brought that up, because I think it's a good point that you don't have to be artistically or musically talented to use those as a form of expression.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some ways that you have seen different clients express their grief? I did a journaling with grief group last week for a local church, and we really practiced different ways of journaling. I think I practiced 5 or 6 different examples with them. And it was so funny in that group. None of them really liked the same one, but they all found one that spoke to them. And so then what I challenged them with was, so keep this going, this week, just one time this week, set a 5-minute timer and sit down and do it again, and try this again as just a way of expression. And that goes to the dosing that you were talking about, Lauren. And, we have a previous episode on this podcast where we talk about dosing grief. And so that was an example through expression. What are some other ways that you've seen people utilize expression?
I always think about this one client I had who really got into kickboxing. That physical movement can be such a powerful form of expression. And for her, that was a really helpful way of coping with the death of her dad.
Yeah.
I had a client to express their grief through art. And so they were able to use all of these beautiful different colors to represent how they're feeling. And so within the canvas, you saw red and blue and yellow, and these were all of the feelings that they were experiencing. And one of the things that they talked about is just how they felt such a release to be able to paint their feelings and to be able to see it. And it was such an easier way for them to be able to express it and talk about it.
I had a client who was struggling so badly with expression and just could not find what was working for him. And then one day he was chopping wood, and he came in and told me how much better he felt. And he chopped a lot of wood that day. And I said, tell me more about that. And he started telling me about when he was chopping the wood and what he was thinking about and how he was approaching each log and how tears came, some yelling came. And I said, that's expression. And so that's something that he's continued to use. Again, it's not something he can do every day, but he looks forward to that. He really needs that physical release because it taps in with his emotions, and he lets both go. So that's another way.
I remember we did a group with our teenagers once where we had them come up with a playlist of different songs for their grief. And they got so into that because, as Christy was saying, music can be such a powerful form of expression. It can really allow us to tap into some of those emotions. And it also served the purpose of allowing them to share it with each other. So they were talking about those feelings. They were using music. Sometimes they would play a little clip. And so there's ways of combining these different forms of expression.
Something that is coming to my heart now is when we created the screen boxes with our kiddos and putting motions and emotions, and they were able to create these beautiful screen boxes. And we just talked about the importance of letting out those feelings and sometimes dealing with anger.
Well, and a screen box is a great example, and that's something that people can make at home. It was a cereal box, and we stuffed it with newspaper or tissue paper, and then you put a paper towel holder at the top of that cereal box, and you just tape it, and you can yell through that tube into the box, and the box absorbs it. So that is a great form of expression. That's something that we've done with our children in groups, families can do, and because sometimes that's the form of expression we need, is we just need to yell, and sometimes other people around us maybe don't appreciate our yelling. And so a screen box is a great tool. I'm glad you brought that up, and something that's so easy to create and to use.
Absolutely. Yes.
And then another one of these categories of coping skills that I think goes hand in hand with expression is memorialization, which is essentially actively doing things that help us to remember our loved ones and continue to feel a connection with them. And so, I emphasize that word, actively doing things. And so I mentioned with expression, we want to show our grief outside of ourselves, and memorialization goes along with that. We want to show our remembrance, and we want to show that connection outside of ourselves in some way. There's a lot of power in putting action to that. And that doesn't mean that it always has to be something big or elaborate or stressful, like planning a big event. Certainly, sometimes we choose to do that. We want to do that. Those types of events and activities, things like funerals, memorial services, or maybe later on down the line, gatherings on special days with groups of loved ones, serve a really important function, and that can be very helpful for some people. But that's not the only forms of expression. There's things that you can do individually or just with a few people very close to you that can also be very meaningful. And I think that's what's so important, is it's finding what feels meaningful for you. What are the ways that you feel like you can connect with your loved one? And so just some things that have come up with people we have worked with. I mean, some of this, it's very simple, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, for example, sharing memories with people, even when it doesn't always have to be something that's planned, even when it just sort of comes up, you're driving in the car, you see something and, oh, that reminds me of mom, special objects. Maybe it's either things that belonged to the person who died or just things that remind you of them. And sometimes people may make things, they may give things as gifts. There's something I think very helpful about having an object that's, something physical and tangible. You can hold it, you can touch it, you can keep it close to you. That can be very comforting. Of course, pictures, sometimes people may wear items that belong to their loved one or that are a connection to them. People will have various forms of spiritual connections. For example, a lot of times people will feel a connection to, for example, seeing a cardinal and view that as, a moment where they just feel close to their loved one, and that can be very special to them. Or another, animal or sight that they can see that just feels like a little moment of connection. Favorite foods, favorite meals, favorite restaurants of your loved ones, or things that you shared with them, doing either activities or even forms of service work that are associated with a cause that is connected to your loved one or meaningful to them in some way. And this, I mean, that's just a short list. Memorialization, like expression, is only limited by your own creativity and what is meaningful to you. And so we've had a lot of people just share some really interesting and creative ways that they have felt that connection to their loved one.
Lauren, you've brought up some really good ideas, and I've had clients to tell me releasing balloons has been a form of memorialization. Build-A-Bears with their loved one's voice in it is such a way of honoring them. And when you're feeling overwhelmed or sad, you can just press that palm, that little hand, and you're able to hear their voice. And we know that with memorialization, of course, it brings sadness because it's just that reminder that they're no longer here. But at the same time, it gives us comfort to know that I can do these things in honor of them.
I know for me personally, I have a lot more green clothing in my wardrobe. Green was never a color I really wore a lot of. My nephew was born on St. Patrick's Day, and so we associate green with him. And since he's died and died tragically, there's a searching and a yearning for connection with him. And so I have found that through the color green. And I found first that I was just gravitating toward it. And then I started realizing that I enjoyed wearing it. And it's something that I can do and nobody else in the world knows. Well, now our listeners might know, but when I wear it, and sometimes it's very conscious that I'm just like, oh, I'm feeling a connection and green just represents him. And other times it's not as maybe a direct choice, but it's there. And so that's a nice thing I know that I've noticed for me, because memorialization, has been challenging or just I couldn't find what was feeling right. And then it was green. And so that's just something that I've been able to use. Other people, we hear a lot about, when people are trying to figure out how do I celebrate a birthday or an anniversary, sometimes it is going back to that favorite food or where did they like to go, what restaurant. And maybe you weren't able to go there the first birthday, but then it might feel right to do it. And so that's the thing about memorialization is that what feels right to you will kind of change with time as well. And as you're maybe, utilizing more of these other coping skills, if you're expressing and you have support, then you may feel more comfortable with going to a certain place for an act of remembrance. So I love that because a lot of times people think, well, we had the funeral, that was our act of memorialization. Or, when we start to talk about this sometimes with people, they'll get worried that we want them to have a second funeral. It's like, no, these are small ways that can be connectors to you. And when we have those connectors, it feels like we're not fighting our grief as much. And then that allows for expression and other things to take place a little bit more naturally. And I find when people really start using acts of memorialization, I've had clients tell me, I feel like I'm able to breathe a little bit more. And what I'm hearing in that is I'm not fighting that grief. I'm not resisting it. I'm actually embracing it.
Making that space for it and memorialization, I think, really helps with that. And we've talked a lot about, activities, but another key piece of memorialization is just noticing the ways that your loved one is still a part of you.
Yes.
Maybe, they taught you something or influenced you in some way, and you can just have that awareness of the ways that they're still a part of you. And one thing, when we talk about memorialization, a lot of times we talk about the idea of continuing bonds and continuing to have a relationship with your loved one after they've died. And of course, it looks different now, but the goal is not to forget them. The goal is not to move on and live your life without them. It is learning how to live your life with them still a part of it, but in a different way.
Absolutely. I've had people will comment that, they found something funny, just something random that was funny. And it links them back to, oh, I remember my dad told me that. Or just, again, it's that continued bonds of, oh, I find that funny now, but they found that funny and I haven't thought about that in so long. And so, again, I think when people embrace expression and memorialization and take some of that intensity off, it allows for some of this more naturalness to flow. And that's actually ends up helping people feel better because we're not fighting it so much. And we're remembering. And ultimately, that's what we all want. We want to remember. Well, there's another form of coping that oftentimes I think people are so excited when they hear that we acknowledge that this is really a form of coping. So let's talk about that.
Yes. Distractions and avoidance. This is something that people are usually surprised, but as you said, very happy to hear that this is a part of coping with grief. We know that it's important to lean into our grief and give ourselves permission to grieve, but we also need breaks from our grief. And so it's really about finding that healthy balance of knowing when to pick up our grief and sit it back down. And there are so many ways that we can use distractions and avoidance in a healthy way. Of course, movies, watching your favorite TV show. I like to call them comfort shows. Going to work is a healthy way of finding that balance. Playing video games, home decorating, organizing your closet, and yes, sleep is a healthy form of avoidance and distractions. So
Playing games on your phone, mindlessly scrolling, social media. We are telling you as grief counselors, these things are okay. But with all of these, it's dosing. We can't live in one category forever, even though we would like to. But that's why we do it. That's why many people are drawn to playing solitaire on their phone. And an hour goes by because we need it. We need a distraction. We need some avoidance.
I agree. You know, as we said, of course, the importance of dosing our grief is needed, but we don't want to get immersed so much into our grief that it becomes hard to get out of it. And so having these things is so healthy in order for us to continue to move forward in our grief journey.
And, you know, with these, it might be that, you know, you may have noticed, for example, that you are already doing some of these things, but there may be some judgment, self-judgment that goes along with that, you know, kind of like what Angela's saying, oh gosh, I just quote unquote wasted a whole hour. And so I think with this, it's not necessarily changing what you're doing as much as changing the way you talk to yourself about what you're doing. And, you know, we encourage you to look at it and label it as a form of coping, that this is a way of intentionally stepping away from your grief, of giving yourself a break. You know, of course, we know that it's impossible to completely step away from it, but what you're doing is you're stepping away from the intensity of it. And that back and forth of leaning in and stepping away is a healthy way of working through this grief journey.
And some people will say that maybe what served as a form of distraction before the death doesn't work now. For example, people will talk about reading a lot, like, oh, I've always been such a reader and now I can't read. I cannot read the same sentence and I don't even know what I'm reading. And so sometimes with our grief, our forms of distraction will change. In that self-judgment you were talking about, Lauren, I had a client say, I've never been someone to play games on my phone, and now that's what I'm doing. And so, well, what did you do before? Oh, I was a big reader, but I can't do that now. So this is serving a purpose right now. It is what you can tolerate. You know, maybe we watch how long we do it. Also, you're probably not going to do it forever, but you're needing it right now. And you need a distraction. We need distraction. And so, again, that's why I said that before we started talking about this one, because when we talk about this with clients, they're like, distraction and avoidance. Yes, I'm so good at this one. And so, again, we're going to say there's 6 different categories we're talking about today. And we certainly want to work to, have some of our coping coming from all areas, not just one category 100%, but distraction and avoidance is a way that we can cope, and it serves as a healthy form.
I agree. Our bodies have a way of telling us what we need. It's important to listen to that. If we're needing to step away and get on the phone for a little bit, we have to acknowledge that and know that it's okay to distract ourselves for a moment, or go outside, sit on the porch, go for a walk. All of these things are healthy ways to distract ourselves in order for us to make it through the day.
And, we have talked about this need to sometimes step away from the intensity of the emotions. And distraction is, of course, one way of doing that. And another is developing ways of regulating those emotions or of calming when you are experiencing, those intense moments. And, I think it's important to note that, when we experience grief, we experience it in waves. And there are times where those emotions are naturally more intense and times where naturally it's calmer. A lot of times we use that metaphor of the ocean and the waves, of course, because of that, because, there are times where it feels, the waves are big and it feels very choppy. And then there's times where it feels calmer. But in those moments where the grief maybe feels very intense and feels very overwhelming, there are things that you can do to just help to regulate that. For example, various forms of deep breathing exercises or meditations. Sometimes people use things like yoga or mindfulness exercises. Christy mentioned, taking walks in nature earlier. You notice a lot of these serve multiple functions. Listening to soothing movement, or calming or supportive physical touch. These are just some examples. And again, it's some of this takes a little bit of practice. It takes a little bit of trial and error. It takes a little bit of finding what feels calming for you. But what we find is that as people develop some of these and work in this area of coping, they start to feel as though they have a little bit more of a feeling of control of their grief. I don't know if grief ever feels completely within our control, but I guess maybe another way of phrasing that is it feels less outside of our control. And there's a little bit more of a predictability to it. Essentially, you're coming to understand your grief better as you work with all of these coping skills. You're coming to know your grief better. And with that knowledge comes the knowledge of, okay, what coping skill do I need to pull from my tool belt here?
And there's so many different places you can find, some guided breathing exercises, meditations. Our YouTube channel, we certainly have some available there, some guided imagery that you can do, and that regulation and calming. And a lot of times too, we'll hear that people are really in need of this at night because, and this is really for all ages, especially if we're going and we're trying to push that grief to the back of the shelf, like Lauren mentioned in the beginning. When we finally lay down at night and we settle down and our brain says, oh, she's going to let me think now. And then it's going to flood you with thoughts that sometimes we need some calming and regulation at night. And so that might be a place to practice some of these where you can get an app and listen to a guided imagery or doing some breath work. You can Google hand breathing. That's one that you can do in the dark at night in your bed. And that is really, it works for many, many people and helps create some regulation so that that anxiety can kind of settle down, their grief can settle down, and they can end up resting. So they do take practice.
I agree, Angela. A lot of people tell me that going to bed at night is a difficult thing for a lot of people. And so what helps is having a sense of routine to help signal to the body that it's time to unwind, it's time to rest. And so dimming the lights can be helpful, essential oils, listening, as you said, Lauren, to soft music. And of course, as you said, certain coping skills go in different categories. So a hot bath, again, I know I discussed it as part of self-care, but this can be as part of the regulation and calming as well. So I agree.
Even sometimes just putting your hand kind of on your stomach and really focusing on the rise and fall of your stomach with your breath, just something that helps you tune yourself into your body, into your breath to help with some calming. So we've talked about 6 different categories of coping. At the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, we believe that grief comes like waves, and the level of the intensity of those waves changes. We do not believe in giving out steps or a checklist that we mark off and that we, arrive at the ending point of our grief and we're cured. We wish that could be the case, but we know that that's not. But these 6 areas of coping are about as close as you're going to get to kind of a guide from us, because we know that these 6 areas are needed. And what that means is an element of balance. You have to go into all 6 of these to really cope well with grief. So we talked about support, self-care, expression, memorialization, distraction and avoidance, and regulation and calming. And we know that it's important to seek balance in your coping, and that your needs are going to change day to day, sometimes moment to moment. And we just hope that you'll try to identify some coping skills in all of these categories that maybe are working for you, or maybe you've heard some here today that you think you might try because maybe something that you've used in the past is not working, or that you're seeing that your needs are different and that you might need to fine-tune that. And so again, some days you're going to be pulled to distraction and avoidance, but other days we may have to pull ourselves back over into the category of expression or one of the other categories. We know that all 6 and a balance of the 6 is what helps us grieve in a healthy way. Christy and Lauren, thank you both so much for being here today. I appreciate it. I appreciate what you do for your clients and for the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. Is there anything else that you all wanted to share?
No, I'm just so honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.